Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today you are not seeing or not hearing me using my microphone that I have been using for the past few months because a few minutes ago it was literally stolen by a magpie. And I don't know how to chase these fellows up their little trees, and since people seem to complain about my volume no matter whether there's a microphone or not, I'm not in a hurry to go get another one. The magpies can have it. I guess they're putting it to better use than I was. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit today, if I didn't introduce myself, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously the University of California. What I want to talk about is the way that Norse myth can be inconsistent and why it is. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. People worry about Christian influence on Norse myth, but largely what they worry about are that the things they don't like in Norse myth are things they don't like, right? They want to explain it away as being the influence of the other culture that Norse mythology is sort of filtered through in the form of the written sources that it's preserved in, and of course, that is the culture of medieval Christian Scandinavia. But I tend to think that there's actually not that much Christian influence on specific myths or on the character of specific gods or something like that, but rather on the way that both in the Middle Ages and today, we want Norse mythology to be one consistent system. But it really is not. The poems of the Poetic Edda are composed orally probably many centuries before they're written down in many different places and many different times by people who had different, shall we say, denominations or sects of this religion. There's no reason to think that a Dane in the 800s would think all the same things as an Icelander in the 900s, right? And furthermore, since these myths are primarily stories and not actually religious documents, right? We actually have no information whatsoever about how to worship the Norse gods, only about their narratives. It's not surprising that certain things would be changed from one version of a story to another, because these aren't exactly, creeds or psalms or prayers or rituals. So it might be better to think of each myth as kind of being its own world, a little bit like different issues in one comic book series about one set of comic book characters. Now, I'm not trying to insult the Norse gods or anything like that by saying that you should think of this as having the continuity of a comic book. Rather, think about the way that, if you pick up an issue of X-Men from the 1970s, you're going to see a lot of the same characters as in an issue of X-Men from today. You're going to see probably Wolverine, Jean Grey, Professor X, that kind of those people. But the story from the 2010s is probably not going to be exactly consistent with the story from the 1970s, right? You might have two characters in a relationship in that 1970s version who aren't in the 2010s version. You might have someone who has died in the 1970s version who's still alive in the 2010s version, that sort of thing. And I think that myths are often the same way. Those inconsistencies are actually, in a sense, a result of the fact that what's consistent in myth is the characters and not the events that surround them. Think about the way that in the poem Thrymskvida, Thor wants Freyja to marry Thrymr at the beginning when he finds out that Thrymr wants to marry Freyja in exchange for giving back Thor's hammer Mjolnir. Freyja is already married, right, to Odr, who's probably Odin, but that's never mentioned as a justification for her not wanting to marry Thrymr. Instead, she just says, oh, everyone would think that I was the most lustful of women if I were to marry Thrymr. Right. There's no particular reason she even needs to be married in the version of the narrative in this poem. She just doesn't want to be considered lustful. So, I think today, yes, you could say, all right, she's married in that poem, but who knows, right? Because in different sources, sometimes it's Freyja who owns the feather skin, sometimes it's Frigg who owns the feather skin, and it doesn't matter. Each poem is its own little world, its own little story. We worry about this consistency today, but I don't think that there's a reason to think that in the oral literature they were transmitted in that people were really that worried about the consistency. For another example, think about Batman. In the 1960s and today, there's a concept of who Batman is. He's a guy who wears black, he dresses kind of like a bat, he fights crime, The reason he does this is that he was a rich kid whose parents were killed by a criminal, and so now he wants to fight the criminals who've infested his city. All of that is pretty consistent between a 1960s version of Batman, say in that old black and white TV show, and say the version with Christian Bale. But the specific things that happen to this consistent Batman character are very different from one version to another, right? Or James Bond, right? James Bond, whether he's played by Sean Connery or Daniel Craig or Pierce Brosnan or whatever, is a British guy, wears a suit, who's a spy, who shoots usually a Walther PPK. I guess it was a different kind of Walther in the 80s in some of those movies. But, he's a fairly consistent character. He sleeps with a lot of women. He gambles. He drinks, I think, martinis. I don't know enough about alcoholic drinks. Right, but then, like, in each different story, there's no indication necessarily that the previous stories that have been told about him have even happened. In a very similar way, stories about Thor can be told without being predicated on earlier stories told about Thor. Same thing with a story about Froya, or a story about Odin or Loki, or etc. And by the time these stories are being written down, remember that we have yet another element, which is that people don't actively believe in these gods anymore. By the time of Snorri, or the time that the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda, is written down in the 1200s, this is medieval Christian Iceland's Star Wars. This is their accepted set of well-known stories about gods and heroes, and they don't necessarily even care to try to present a continuous, logically, internally self-consistent canon. Snorri kind of does, but Snorri's the one who's actually trying to make an explanation about the stuff, not just tell a story at night, right? Around the campfire or something. I think a magpie might be just about... thought he was about to knock down the camera. But the stories are well known at his time, right? Early in Snorri's life, his father Sturla had a conflict with a neighbor named Pol, and in Sturlunga Saga we read this interesting scene. Pol's wife leapt forward between the men, that's Sturla and I think Pol himself, with a knife in her hand and stabbed at Sturla, aiming at his eye, and said, "Why not make you more like the one you most want to be like? That's Odin." The blade hit his cheek instead, but made a big wound. So even in this thoroughly Christianized society, 200 years after Iceland had converted to Christianity, people are still telling these stories enough to know the characteristics of Odin. He is a one-eyed god who also is, well, somewhat selfish in orientation, apparently like Sturla's enemies thought that he was. So don't be disturbed by the fact that Norse myths are not consistent. Don't be disturbed by the fact that we can't necessarily say exactly what happened in a given myth, like how did Thor fish for Jormungandr, which is very different in the Prose Edda versus in Heimskringla in the Poetic Edda. The fact is, there's a core story, there's a core set of characters, if you will, and that's what's consistent. Beyond that, in the details of who did what, and when, and what sequence it happened in, and who was there, and why it all happened, and exactly where it happened, and exactly when, and who said what exactly, those things are going to vary from poem to poem, from Edda to Edda, from saga to saga, just like they would between different issues of a comic book. Well, I hope this has been somewhat informative, helped answer some questions or concerns that you might have had about Norse mythology, and particularly about the Eddas. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I hope that you'll consider checking out my translations. I have translated the Poetic Edda, as well as the Saga of the Volsungs, with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. And in September 2019, my book called The Wanderer's Havamal, which includes not just Havamal from the Poetic Edda in my English translation, but also in Old Norse with my commentary explaining the Old Norse text, will appear. And then sometime in the future, my translation of the Saga of Hervor and Haetheric, as well as the Saga of Rolf Kraki and the Prose Edda, will all appear. I also have made more than 280 videos about Norse myth, language, culture, and sagas on this channel. And I have a Patreon, which consists of the almost 1,000 people who have made the difficult to understand but much appreciated choice to support me monetarily so I can continue to make these videos for free in beautiful places with my magpie friends who are surrounding me, even if you can't see that in the video. All right, well, for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.